When Dr. Scott Gottlieb took charge as Commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration earlier this year, he acknowledged that opioid abuse crisis was his agency's most pressing problem. Since then, the FDA has begun to lay out its approach to tackling the crisis. For more on its role in curtailing the epidemic, we are pleased to be joined by FDA Commissioner Dr. Scott Gottlieb. Bob, back over to you.
Thank you. Let me give you my mic back.
Very important issue. I do want to ask you about.
Thank you.
Today that there's a defense policy bill that being ironed out on Capitol Hill that would reportedly usurp FDA's power on approving drugs and devices. Is that accurate, and do you support that legislation?
Well, you're talking about Section 732 of the NDAA, the Defense Reauthorization, and so the language that you're talking about is actually public now. I think it was in the Senate version of the bill, so people can go and take a look at it and draw their own conclusions. I'll tell you that, I'm committed in my role, and I know that the senior career staff, particularly in the Biologics Center, because a lot of the DoD products are reviewed in the Biologics Center, are fully committed to trying to make sure we have an efficient process for the development of products destined for the warfighter. And there's an alternative proposal to the language that's in the NDAA, another idea that would apply a breakthrough therapies-like pathway to products that are destined for the warfighter. So DoD products that are intended for use in a battlefield setting would be looked at through a special process that would apply FDA's highest level of regulatory touch to those products to make sure we're giving them, proper oversight, proper supervision, but also accelerating them to market, recognizing that products that address a battlefield setting like freeze-dried plasma, resuscitation devices, do deserve special treatment. We're willing to apply that. I'm fully committed to it. And I think the alternative proposal would achieve a lot of what DoD seeks, which is some ability to get products to the battlefield setting more quickly. The alternative proposal would also couple that breakthrough therapy-like process for products destined for the warfighter with an expansion of FDA's existing emergency use authorization authority. So instead of just having authority to EUA products in a setting of a chemical, biological, or radiological attack, we would now have the authority to also EUA products in a setting of an outbreak of war if there was a product that needed to be emergently deployed in the battlefield. But it would retain it with FDA. We think that's important because we think we provide a level of oversight that helps ensure the safety of products, helps follow up to make sure that if there are adverse events, we're monitoring them, we're collecting that information. So we think keeping it within the FDA context is the right thing, but we think we can both achieve DoD's goal of trying to accelerate products to the battlefield and still keep it in FDA's context.
Who has authored the alternative proposal? Who's pushing it? And this will be an amendment?
Well, the alternative proposal, there's language that's been shared with both the House and the Senate. We fully support that language. I think some of the authorizing committees that have jurisdiction of FDA support that language. But it's definitely, that language has definitely been shared with the Senate Armed Services Committee and the House Armed Services Committee. And I'm willing to make whatever modifications folks want to consider with respect to that language. I think it's important to keep these things within the context of the FDA process, and I'm fully committed to trying to expedite products for the warfighter. And I will have the time, if they pass the language that has been put forward, the alternative language, we will commit to very quickly putting in place the implementing guidance to stand up that process. We put out a statement last night speaking to one particular product that has been a particular flashpoint, I think was the impetus for some of the language in 732 related to freeze-dried plasma. And the statement said that we think we could approve that, fully approve it, and validate its safety and effectiveness as early as 2018. I'm pretty sure that if we're able to follow through on that commitment, and we don't often make commitments like that, that's going to be a faster approval then DoD would be able to stand up their new process if they get this legislation in place.
Would that be, just last question on that, would that be early 2018?
It would be at some point in 2018, but I will still commit. I will still challenge anyone to argue that even if this language would have passed and DOD were to stand up the 5-person committee and the review process that they're going to need to stand up behind that, their ability to get that in place and in EUA, freeze-dried plasma is probably going to take longer than I think our ability to get this on the market through our regular approval process, recognizing that we're going to expedite this and recognizing that, the DOD has a legitimate concern that FDA historically hasn't looked at the warfighter and products destined for that setting, I think in the right context. And I've been at FDA before, so I have some historical perspective on this. I'm fully committed to making sure that we create a process that will allow DoD products to be looked at in the right context and against the right need and against a battlefield risk-benefit calculus, not a civilian risk-benefit calculus. The language that has been put forward, the alternative language, would allow that to happen.
Okay, so on opioids, you said last week that to get ahead of this epidemic, we have to be potentially intrusive and get outside of our comfort zone. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think that there's a lot of things that we're going to need to contemplate doing that I think there's going to be people who have concerns about if we start looking at mandatory education or taking steps to try to restrict dispensing through changes in packaging. I think there's going to be a lot of folks who have concerns about that and are going to think that that's intrusive and it's a form of regulation of the practice of medicine. But I think we're at a point now that this crisis, the proportion of this crisis is so large that the kinds of things we're going to have to contemplate to get in front of it are going to be things that, 5, 10 years ago we might not have wanted to do because we would have thought that they were too intrusive into aspects of medical practice. But now we might not have an alternative if we're really going to be serious about trying to take the kinds of measures that I think are going to get in front of this crisis.
And obviously it's got to be multi-layered. You've mentioned short-term supply of packaging. What about, are there, as far as discarding pharmaceuticals? How far can the FDA go in regulating some of these, mandating some of the stuff? And how much is it that you'll need Congress to do something?
Well, not just Congress and the FDA, but you're also going to need the supply chain and other participants. I think that there's certain aspects of this crisis where FDA can play a more profound role, and then there's certain aspects where it's going to require a lot of stakeholders to collaborate. The parts where FDA has obviously a direct relationship to is in the product approval process, trying to develop non-addictive alternatives to opioids, trying to develop opioids that have shorter shelf lives, so they degrade, so they lose their opioid-like potential. Taking steps to try to reduce overall exposure to opioids, trying to take steps to either better educate physicians or make modifications in packaging, as you started out asking me about, that would reduce overall exposure. We know a lot of people who become addicted to opioids are going to be medically addicted. Their first exposure is going to be through a legitimate prescription. Right. Oftentimes that's for an immediate release formulation of the drugs, and so we need to take steps to make sure that people are prescribed opioids, it reflects careful judgment, and that the dose that they're being prescribed comports with the clinical circumstance. So, 30 days dispensing for minor surgery or an orthopedic injury, that might not make a lot of sense.
How much in dealing with this epidemic is percentage of your job, and how often are you getting out to states really hit hard?
It's become a big percentage of my job. It's hard to sort of break down time. People always ask me, how much time do you spend on food and tobacco and on new drugs, and it's really hard to figure that out. All I know is I feel like it's a 24/7 job right now. But this is a top priority. This was the very first thing I talked about when I came to the agency, the very first policy process that I stood up when I came to FDA, and I would say I work on this every day. There's some aspect of this I work on it every day. I've done some state visits, went to some treatment centers, met folks who are working on this problem at a state level. I interface with a lot of state agencies on a regular basis. We're going to be doing some more state visits as well as continue to bring in elements of the supply chain. So the PBMs, the health plans, people that we think we could partner with, that we traditionally maybe haven't worked with, but we think we could work with them here.
In June, you asked a drug maker to pull an opioid off the market. Are more of those requests going to happen?
Well, this was a first from a regulatory standpoint, because we asked for the market withdrawal of an opioid product based solely on an assessment of the illicit risk of the product. So the risks we were looking at weren't manifested in the labeled use of the product, but in the off-label use, or not the off-label use, the illicit use of the product, and related to specifically the way this particular product was being reformulated by people who were abusing it into an injection form that was creating some unique risks, including something that was in the drug itself called an excipient was creating an autoimmune phenomena, so it was creating a particular risk. We're going to continue to look at illicit risk as a component of how we assess risk-benefit both pre- and post-market. I'm not saying FDA hasn't historically done that. FDA always did some component of that, but this is going to become a more prominent part of how we look at risk in this setting, particularly in the post-market setting. We've stood up a big epidemiological group to look at patterns of abuse and misuse. And that helps give us an early indication of how products might be being abused and misused and diverted. And it gives us the ability to investigate those circumstances and look at those risks as a component of how we assess risk in the post-market setting. We made a comment last week at the National Press Club, made a comment about oxymorphone. And we have epidemiological data that at least suggests that oxymorphone might be more likely to be abused because perhaps it's more likable, it's a more abusable compound. We're following that up with a scientific study right now looking at the abuse potential of that compound relative to other opioid compounds. And if we do find that it's more likable and more likely to be abused, because we do what's called likability studies to assess the abuse potential of controlled substances, if we find that it's more likely to be abused, we might take additional regulatory action with respect to the whole class.
What is the FDA's power here? I mean, what if you ask a drug company to take something off the market and they don't do it?
There's an administrative process that we'd have to go through.
Would it be rulemaking or
no?
enforcement action?
There's a process. There's an appeal process, and then eventually it'd go before an administrative law judge. Not having gone through that process myself, and not having only partially completed my law degree. Every doctor at FDA thinks they're a lawyer, and every lawyer thinks they're a physician. So it's sweet justice at the agency, but. Not being steeped in this aspect of the law, I don't want to get out ahead of my skis, but there is a process and eventually ends up before an administrative law judge.
Okay. And as far as the study on oxymorphone, is that going to take 6 months, a year? Is it like any idea? I'm getting back to the timeline again.
Yeah, you're very focused on regulatory timelines. That study was set in motion probably 2 or 3 months ago. It was set in motion at the time around the time that we withdrew Opana ER. I believe it's underway. We should have the results fairly soon. So I think it's something that we could speak to at least probably within the first quarter of 2018.
Okay.
Just sort of judging by how long it takes to complete a study like that and when we would get results.
How often are you talking to, I know you talk to a lot of stakeholders, but what is your relationship with drug manufacturers and communicating that, hey, we may have to do some things that you may not like?
So, I obviously, we put out a lot of statements. I've been pretty communicative trying to issue statements and post speeches, and so I try to communicate with the public through material that we put out. I don't have a lot of direct contact with drug makers, to be perfectly candid. When I speak to the industry, it's usually at board meetings, maybe for the pharma board meeting, the bio board meeting, or at trade association events like that. I don't take a lot of individual meetings with sponsors. There are exceptions. I've had a lot of individual calls with sponsors related to Puerto Rico and the manufacturing issues. I've called all the sponsors, all the major sponsors that have critical drugs in Puerto Rico and have sole source drugs that we'd be worried about, and I've asked them directly about their manufacturing issues down there to get a firsthand assessment from them. So there are exceptions where I will reach out directly to regulated industry, but generally I try to talk about policy issues in more generalized formats, so I'm communicating with everyone at the same time.
There are so many government agencies that are dealing with opioid. How is the interagency communication, whether it's DEA or CMS, DOJ?
I think it's very good. I will say I think it's much better than it was last time I was in the Bush administration. It's not a snub on the Bush administration or anything, but it's just things have evolved, and I think there's much more collaboration. I think at that time, we had collaboration with DEA and DOJ. And other agencies, CMS, but I think right now the level of collaboration is very tight. We work very closely with DEA. I just met with my counterpart there last week. I've talked to him a number of times. I've met with the head of CBP a number of times already about things we're doing to try to beef up our resources in the international mail facilities as it relates to the import of illicit substances. I work closely with CMS. I know SEMA very well. I talk to her regularly. So there's a lot of collaboration. I mean, this gets back to the very first question you asked me about, which was DOD. I think we're at a point right now where FDA has a much better platform than it's ever had for collaborating with other agencies. And I would look forward to extending that same platform to DOD.
What about prevention and labeling? And you mentioned that there may be some things you look back 5, 10 years ago from now that needed to get done but are going to make people uncomfortable. You know, regulations take a long time to finalize. So how, if you're going to mandate certain things, is that the best avenue, or is it better for Congress to step in and mandate something?
Well, it doesn't have to take a long time. I mean, you know, we've gotten guidance documents out in a matter of months and regulations done in well under a year. If it's a priority, we'll get it done quickly. We've pushed a couple of things out very quickly since I've been at FDA, and this is a priority. So if we settle on a policy route, we can get something done quickly. Remember, if Congress does legislate, and I welcome Congress's involvement here. I mean, I think Congress has been a good partner, and our authorizing committees have been a good partner on this issue. But even if Congress legislates and mandates something, if something's in statute, you still have to write implementing regulations, and then those implementing regulations need guidance oftentimes. So the process isn't any quicker. I mean, if there are things that we can do with our current authorities, we can get them done quickly. I think the challenge is that there's places where we might want to act that our current authorities aren't clear. And so, you know, getting more clarity from Congress could be helpful in certain regards. And those are the places that, you know, we've had discussions, and I'm very eager to work with Congress.
What specific areas would it be a little fuzzy?
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about issues around aspects of our seizure authority to seize products in the IMF, illicit substances. You know, you asked me about the issue around the product that we asked for the market withdrawal of, and the fact that we did that based solely on an assessment of the illicit risk. Congress could come in and legislate there and you know, provide a lot of clarity in legislation. We have the clarity in our own statute, we believe, and we'll implement guidance as well to elucidate that. But there's places Congress could, even if we have the authority, can provide clarity around it or boundaries on it that could be helpful. You know, I think Congress plays an important role here, and there's a lot of interest in doing things on Capitol Hill.
I'm sure.
On this issue.
Sure. We will open it up for questions, so please raise your hand, and then we'll go here in the front and just identify yourself. Hold on one sec for a mic. Oh, we'll go. Okay, yeah, we'll go to him first, and then come to you.
Good morning. Charlie John, Public Policy for Walgreens. I previously served as the pharmacist for our company, so I've seen a lot of good and bad around this. Thinking about the many patients that absolutely need some of these medications, it's maybe the only thing that's worked for them, but the prudent move might be to limit or perhaps take some of these products off the market. In terms of the alternatives for them, how promising do you feel the science is, I guess, in the applications that the agency is seeing, that we may be close to development of a non-opioid pain medication, and are those qualifying for any of the priority pathways you described?
Well, I mean, we have non-opioid pain medications. I mean, even NSAIDs is a non-opioid pain medication. There's others on the market. Some of the pain medications treat neurological pain, don't treat, you know, things like orthopedic pain. I think the question is probably how close are we to a non-addictive alternative to opioids that acts at the mu receptor but doesn't have the same addictive potential, acts through the G-coupled protein receptor, and I don't want to get... those are in development. I mean, there's early science around that. I don't want to get too specific, but you do see early science around that, and people can pull the INDs and see what's in development. There's no question that a product that addresses pain that has a non-addictive potential to be an alternative to opioids could qualify for certainly fast track, and many products have qualified for fast track, but even breakthrough therapy status. And if there were products that were opioid alternatives that currently qualified for breakthrough therapy status, the public might not know, because that's commercial confidential information. A lot of companies don't disclose it when they get that. So it's quite possible that there are companies that have qualified for breakthrough therapy designation that are non-addictive alternatives to opioids, but you know, it's not something that's been publicly disclosed. We also have a lot of development going on with abuse deterrent formulations or formulations that are manipulation resistant. And I think we're in the early innings of that kind of technology as well. I mean, there's opportunities to see things like prodrugs, where, you know, it's an opioid-like drug, but it doesn't develop its opioid-like properties until it goes through a first pass effect, until it becomes metabolized by the liver. So that would be a prodrug. So it's not an opioid until the body actually breaks it down. And that's the kind of technology I think that could offer a potentially useful alternative. We also have to keep in mind, the opioids are systemic therapy for pain that's sometimes localized, and so there's many settings where an innovative device could be a useful alternative to taking systemic therapy. And so we need to look at systemic alternatives in the context of what are the device opportunities as well.
Question up here.
Thank you. Good morning, Commissioner Gottlieb, and thank you for being here. First of all, just a comment up front. I'm Lieutenant General retired John Morgan, U.S. Army, former land component commander for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and NATO. So my thanks to you for the work that you're doing at FDA to help speed products to the warfighter and folks that are young men and women in uniform that find themselves out in the combat zone. That's great work. But secondly, as we transition here to opioids, and you recently were on the Hill in front of the Energy and Commerce Committee, and the CDC representative, Center for Disease Control, mentioned, I think it might have even been the chairman, that said that for every opioid death, there are at least another 60 addictions that are out there nationwide for every death. Military has been sort of out front in terms of collaboration, interoperability, and information sharing tools and techniques. Do you believe that at FDA that there is a place to help get out in front of the problem with prescription drug monitoring and tracking programs that see the prescription in real time before a patient leaves, let's say, a pharmacy with an opioid, the ability to monitor prescriptions in real time? Do you believe that there's technology, and is there a place at FDA to take on these kind of emerging capabilities?
Well, if the technology existed, or it exists, if that kind of technology was put into practice in a uniform way nationally, it would certainly make our jobs easier because we would have a platform to collect information from, adverse event information in particular, and use patterns that would inform our regulatory decisions. That kind of a platform wouldn't be something that FDA would necessarily mandate nor maintain, but I think that those kinds of approaches make a lot of sense. And we've seen some legislation introduced that would mandate national electronic prescribing for controlled substances. I think that's a very interesting proposal that we ought to take a very serious look at, because you start to think about the interplay between national electronic prescribing and the PDMP programs, and you could have a system that provides much more oversight of inappropriate dispensing or people who might go doctor shopping for the purpose of trying to collect prescriptions and divert them into illicit uses. And so those kinds of approaches, I think, could make a lot of sense. But those are the kinds of things that when you talk about, make some people feel uncomfortable too. So when I talk about getting outside our comfort zone, these are the kinds of things I think we're going to need to contemplate. States have done this, and I think New York's probably the furthest along in fully implementing electronic prescribing for controlled substances. But these things have worked at a state level.
There. One more question.
Good morning. My name is Rachel Tetlow. I'm with the American Congress of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. Thank you so much for being here today. I wanted to ask you a follow-up question on what you mentioned before about NSAIDs being an existing alternative. When we look at access to medications for pregnant women, a lot of the NSAIDs that are out there currently are known teratogens for pregnant women. And so when we're looking for alternatives to opioids, I am hoping that you can speak to FDA's focus on populations that are typically underrepresented in research for drug trials and other things to try to make sure that there are alternatives out there for these populations.
Yeah, I appreciate the question, and I'll just say there's a challenge with studying drugs, particularly in women of childbearing age and in pregnant populations because of concerns around liability. And we've tried to address this through guidance in the past. We've also tried to address it through ways to look at the liability system itself. And we worked on some policies last time I was at the agency in the prescription drug labeling rule. Just taking a sort of step back about NSAIDs generally, because since you asked the question about NSAIDs, I'll just make a close on a thought about that. There was, I think, a Harvard letter that came out recently that showed NSAID use has dramatically declined in the setting of treatment of rheumatoid arthritis, and it's actually, I think it's no longer recommended as first-line treatment for patients with rheumatological pain. Looking at that trend line of diminished NSAID use, and this grew out of concern around the potential for cardiovascular risk associated with certain NSAIDs. Obviously, some data that there's small cardiovascular risk associated with certain NSAIDs. Looking at that trend line, it was quite dramatic in terms of the diminished use of NSAIDs in that setting. I have to believe that some of those patients who are no longer being prescribed NSAIDs were getting immediate release formulations of opioids instead in certain settings. And understanding that exposure to opioids correlates with some level of addiction, I have to also believe that a certain, maybe small percentage, but some proportion of those patients went on to develop some kind of addiction to the opioids. I mean, I think it's intuitive. Obviously, I don't have any evidence. But I think it underscores for us to make sure that we're carefully looking at risk-benefit balance of opioids in a broader context. There are probably situations where even if you assumed the cardiovascular risk associated with the NSAIDs, the NSAID would still have been a better alternative for certain patients than an immediate release formulation of an opioid drug. And so I think just in the medical context, thinking about these things, risk-benefit balance across the continuum of the potential alternatives is exceedingly important. And this is sort of a reminder of that in my view.
That's all the time we have. Please thank the Commissioner for joining us this morning, and I'll hand it back to Joanna. Hey, thanks a lot.